What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the ThrashManiac99 YouTube channel, and I am back with yet another discography ranking, and of course, yeah, it's only been about 2 weeks since the Testament one that I did, but I thought to myself, you know what, I got nothing better to do tonight, so I thought to myself, how about I get this one out for you guys, and this was originally going to be posted on Thursday, but because I'm in a pretty good mood, I decided, you know what, screw it, let's post it tonight on a Tuesday, and that is the discography ranking of one of my all-time favorite bands, among my top 10 favorites of all time, and that is none other than Switzerland's biggest legend, Celtic Frost. So, how I got into Celtic Frost is kind of similar to how I got into Testament, which was 8th grade heading into high school. I was just discovering more extreme metal. Like, I was already into metal as a whole with bands like Avenged Sevenfold, Metallica, Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, and basically like the big mainstream bands. But then I got into thrash pretty big, and then over time got into death metal and a little bit of grindcore, then eventually into black metal and such. And Celtic Frost was always like a common denominator among many of these styles, whether it was classic metal, doom metal, thrash, death, black, or grind. They were always seen as an important influence on many bands that followed. And once I first heard Celtic Frost, I really dug what I heard, and they'd been a favorite of mine ever since. So that does it for how I got into the band. Now let's get into the history of the band. So this band formed out of the ashes of another legendary Swiss band, Hellhammer. Of course, Tom Moyer and Martin Eric Ain both had Hellhammer going in 1984, even though the band had started in 81. Many lineup changes, demos, and even a legendary EP here in 1984. But Hellhammer had always been kind of seen as a joke by many metal fans at that time. Like, they even Tom admitted that they were trying to be much more of a deficient Venom clone than anything else, because it was all about, like, the evil, satanic lyrics and kind of following the footsteps of Venom. But people within the metal scene would tell them, dude, that's noise what you're doing. It's not going to get you anywhere. So, as a result, Hellhammer died, and then the very next day, Celtic Frost was formed by both Tom and Martin, and eventually would bring in already the drummer of Hellhammer at that time, Stephen Priestley, to come in as a session drummer, and in late 1984, we get the release of the legendary EP, Morbid Tales. Now, I gotta confess, originally, when I was going to do this ranking, I was originally going to combine this and the following EP into one album, since the version of the CD I have is essentially both EPs mixed together in one called Morbid Tales. But since they were separate releases originally, I had to separate them. And if I was to have combined them, it would have been my number one, no question. But since I've separated them, the rankings have changed. And Morbid Tales, as a whole for an EP, is my number 2. I have always loved Morbid Tales so much, like all these songs, Into the Crypts of Rays, Visions of Mortality, Procreation of the Wicked, Return to the Eve, just amazing songs, and they go everywhere in terms of tempo and influence. Like, Into the Crypts of Rays is very thrashy and speed metal and Discharge and Motorhead inspired because of that awesome D beat. Visions of Mortality kind of brings in a little bit of a doom influence and then some groove back into the thrash. Let's see, and then Procreation of the Wicked is an essential doom track for the most part, and Return to the Eve is just all about catchy riffs and killer grooves. I will say, though, Dance Macabre, why? Why did we end it with a horror porno, whatever the fuck? I don't know what that was all about, but it is what it is. And then, of course, like I said, it's just mind-boggling how they were using that to enter into the final track, Nocturnal Fear, which is a thrashy barn burner of a song. Yeah, top to bottom, Morbid Tales, I love it, especially the version that I have where it combines this and the following EP that came out. But yeah, this is an all-time legendary EP, one of the top 5 greatest EPs of all time, I would say, and it's my number 2 for Celtic Frost. Now, of course, there were 2 other songs recorded during this same session but weren't released until the following EP, And after the release of Morbid Tales, Tom and Martin was looking for a new drummer, so in walks Reed St. Mark to come in on drums, and he came from America, so you got an American member in a Swiss band, so he had to move all the way to Switzerland to join the band. And in early 1985, we would get the second EP, Emperor's Return. Now, this fell to my number 5. I still absolutely love this EP, but it fell just because I wanted to make room for a couple of the full lengths to go ahead. But Emperor's Return, I love this EP as well. I mean, you got some great songs, like 2 songs from the same session as Morbid Tales, the title track, Morbid Tales, and Dethroned Emperor, which are 2 great songs. And then the other 3, well, one song would end up being on their debut album eventually, and that's Circle of the Tyrants. I do like this version. And then the other 2 songs were great in their own right. Tracks like Visual Aggression and Suicidal Winds. Those 2 songs are thrashy as fuck, especially Visual Aggression. That's like one of the thrashiest things Celtic Frost ever did. So, like I said, if I was to have combined Morbid Tales and Emperor's Return together into one album like the CD that I have, that actually was released in 1999, it would have went to number 1, because that's my favorite thing Celtic Frost ever did. But for this EP, it falls to my number 5, only because I want to make room for a couple of the studio albums to go ahead and give it some more shine for me. But still, this is another great EP. Definitely check it out if you haven't already. Now, of course, following the release of Emperor's Return, the band would go back to the studio to record their official full-length debut album. Now, for this album, Martin Ericain wasn't available to do the bass on this album, so Tom and Reed would pick up Dominic Steiner to come in to play bass on this album, and released later in 1985, we get an absolutely legendary full-length debut, To Mega Therion. This is my number 1 Celtic Frost album, and this is an all-time classic in not just extreme metal, but metal as a whole. Like, this album would prove to be a huge influence on doom metal, black metal, and death metal, as you basically got all the ingredients of what would become those genres in this album. Like, you got some of the slow, doomy foot-stomping moments, you get some of that almost kind of raw production of black metal, but with some instrumentation of what would become death metal. And even Tom Weir's vocals, like I forgot to mention, Tom Weir pioneered, in my opinion, the death metal vocal style. Granted, there were other people that were coming along around the same time, like Cam Lee, Chuck Schuldiner, and Jeff Becerra, that did it in their own way, but as far as who was truly first, I personally think it was Tom Weir, as he lowered his grunt. Like, he kind of took the inspiration of Kronos from Venom, whereas Kronos did just a little bit higher. Tom took it and went lower with it to make it sound more brutal and a little more evil. So, I would argue personally that who was the first death metal vocalist? It's Tom G. Weir, Thomas Gabriel Fisher, whatever you want to call him. But yeah, this album, To Mega Therion, like I said, it's an all-time classic, and the album cover was done by a legendary artist, H.R. Geiger, who Tom Fisher would actually later work for, which is pretty cool relationship that they had before H.R. passed away. But yeah, To Mega Therion, tracks like The Usurper, Jewel Throne, Dawn of Megiddo, I believe that's how you say it, which that is a doom metal opus right there. And of course, the re-recording of Circle of the Tyrants. I love this version of the song more than on Emperor's Return. And then even some other great tracks like Necromantical Screams and let's see, Fainted Eyes. That's a great song that kind of mixes everything that this album has to offer. The doomy stuff, the thrashy stuff, the evil death metal, black metal stuff. Just all in one package. So, I love this album. Granted, I feel like the only thing I have an issue with is how the guitars were pitched up just a notch, which is weird when it should have been in standard tuning. It felt like it was almost like a quarter step up from standard, which is kind of strange, but if you hear it in standard tuning, it sounds even better, I think. So, yeah, To Mega Therion, my number 1. Now, after the release of Tomega Therion, Martin Ericain was officially back into the band as they went out on tour all across the world, even toured here in the States for the first time in 1986 with, funny enough, Tommy and Marky from fellow Swiss legends Corner being their roadies and techs for the US tour. And that was pretty cool because Celtic Frost and Corner's histories have kind of always kind of commingled together because they were both around at the same time. And Tom Warrior actually even did vocals for the legendary Death Cult demo from Corner, ironically in '86, which led to Marky and Tommy becoming roadies for this tour. But they would go back to the studio in late '86, early '87 with a bit of a different sound in mind. And we keep the same. We get the Tom, Martin, and Reed lineup once again for this next album. And released in 1987, we get Into the Pandemonium. Now, I would say out of all the Celtic Frost albums, this is the one that's the most divisive. There's no real in-between. You got people who either... Well, I don't think anyone thinks that it's bad. It's like people say, this is brilliant, or this is okay. I'm going to be on the side that I think this is an awesome album, personally. Although it is my second to last. It's my number 6. Only because there were other albums I liked more than this. But I really love this album. I've always loved this album. Because this was pioneering for what became known as avant-garde metal or experimental metal, where they were experimenting with their sound by incorporating like bongos and different kind of percussion and some ambience and even some symphonic elements. Like, you could also kind of look at this as a pioneering album of what would become symphonic metal, because the orchestral elements are plastered throughout this album. And musically, in terms of the metal side, it's definitely more on the classic metal side with some thrash on top. Like, it's not really the proto-black metal or proto-death metal doomy stuff. Like, there are some doom tracks, but this is more like straight-up classic metal, thrash, mixed with that more avant-garde musical philosophy. Now, the reason why this album is so divisive is Tom Warrior's vocals. Like, the vocals definitely shifted on here. Like, he was doing more like moans for the most part, but when you do get the trademark Tom Warrior vocal style, it's great. Now, like I said, the moans are definitely the thing that makes this album really divisive. I actually like the moaning vocals because it kind of gives it a bit of a gothic rock vibe, because it's no secret Celtic Frost was highly inspired by the gothic rock bands like The Cure, Sisters of Mercy, Christian Death, and wanted to incorporate that into their music, especially on this album. So, I don't mind the moaning vocals. I think they add a unique character to the music being played at hand. But yeah, great songs on here. Like, even the opening cover song, Mexican Radio by Wall of Voodoo, one of my favorite cover songs of all time, but great tracks like Inner Sanctum, which is a heavy, thrashy tune. Babylon Fell, Caress into Oblivion. Even the song One in Their Pride, which was this more like industrial dance track, which is pretty fun, and it does sound like something you would hear in a John Hughes film during the 80s. And then one of the big finales, Rex Irae Requiem, such an epic song. So cool. I love this album top to bottom, but like I said, it's number 6 only because there were just other releases I liked more, but this is a fantastic album. But of course, that's my opinion. So the band would tour heavily on this album, but later in 1987 and heading into 1988, the band broke up for a little while, but then a few months later, Tom relaunched Celtic Frost with a new lineup. Stephen Priestley would come back to play drums, and in walks, for bass, Kurt Victor Bryant, and adding second guitarist Oliver Amberg, who was actually an original member of Corner back when the band started in '83, and this would be the first time they would record as a 4-piece. And, well, they had another different sound in mind, and released in 1988, we get Cold Lake. Now, before anyone says anything, I don't mind hair metal I do like some hair metal songs because they're fun and catchy, and like I said, just fun to listen to. But hearing Celtic Frost do hair metal just sounded really weird, and just my brain cannot compute. I am Levi, I cannot compute with Celtic Frost doing hair metal, ha 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 ha. Yeah, this is my dead last. This is number 7, obviously, and yeah, like, the tones are squawky, the fucking seduce me tonight. Oh my god. I don't want to hear you, Tom Moyer, singing about this. And I find it funny, it's like, at the time, he was really into this era, but now he absolutely ignores and hates this album. And who can blame him? I mean, this album's a pile of garbage. And this is the one thing that stains for, in my opinion, an otherwise perfect discography for Celtic Frost. If this album didn't exist, this would be one of the few bands that I would say does not have a bad album. And then we get this pile of crap, and Juices Like Wine or whatever the fuck. Who gives a shit? Roses Without Thorns. Cherry Orchards, Jim and John. Love you, John, but I had to do that, and it's like, well, John, I'm sorry, but I'm right, you're wrong. I love you either way, but still, it's like, I always say to myself, like, anyone who really loves this album, I would smack in the face and then shake their hand for being kind of weird, but also being a trooper. And John, I'm not saying I would smack you in the face, but come on, man. But I digress. So, yeah, this album should have never happened, and, well, yeah. Although one positive thing came out of this album, and that was the fact that the band got to play at the Hammersmith Odeon in England, which was a huge deal, considering the Hammersmith is a legendary venue for many bands, whether it was rock, metal, what have you. Now, after the release of Cold Lake, Oliver Omberg was fired, and Martin Ericain would come back to the band to take over on bass, while Kurt Victor Bryant would go to guitars. And recording in 1989 and released in 1990, we get Vanity Nemesis. Now, this is my number 4 album. I think out of the entire Celtic Frost discography, this is the most underrated album ever. Like, this is often forgotten about because of the fact that it came out after Cold Lake. But whereas with Cold Lake, yeah, they were trying to go hair metal, but I think the real reason why they went for that was to try and have a longer career and be a little more mainstream. This album, it kind of has that idea of trying to go more mainstream, but brings back heaviness and darkness to it. Like, this honestly is what I think Cold Lake should have been, without the cheese, without the sexy stuff, and without that hair metal idea. Just more of an accessible yet super heavy album. I felt a hiccup come along, but make it a really heavy album, and this album brings back the thrash influence, more of the classic metal overtones, but even sneakily bringing in some gothic metal influence in terms of, like, the female vocals that come in on a couple of tracks. But overall, top to bottom, I love this album, and you even have 2 really good covers of Brian Ferry's This Island Earth, and a unique cover of David Bowie's Heroes. But as far as the original material, songs like Heart Beneath, Third Wine in My Hand, Third from the Sun. The Name of My Bride is particularly memorable because it reminds me of Megadeth. Wings of Solitude is a personal favorite. The title tracks, Vanity and Nemesis, back to back. Fucking amazing songs. Phallic Tantrum, like a super thick and heavy thrash barn burner. And even A Kiss or Whisper is really thrashy. Like, top to bottom, not a single wasted moment. Every song's amazing. It only ranks at 4 just because there were, again, albums I preferred over it. But this is an underrated hidden gem in metal. And for those who have slept on this album, please listen to it again because it will be worth your while. It's fucking awesome. So, there you go with that. Now, of course, the band would tour for the next couple of years and even record some songs for an upcoming compilation that came out in 92 or 93, I forget which. However, in 1993, the band broke up once again and was laid dormant for 8 years. However, the band would reform in 2001, this time Tom Moyer back with Martin Eric Ain, and then walks on drums Franco Sessa to be on drums. Now, before we get into the final album, I do want to make mention of a demo that was recorded in 2001 or 2002, Prototype, and thank God this did not see the light of day as an official release, because this is a giant pile of hot garbage. If this would have been released as an album, it would have been number 8. Easily, because this was like the worst industrial nu metal shit ever. Like, I don't know what they were thinking with this demo, but thank God it was scrapped and did not see the light of day as an official album. Otherwise, oh lord. The amount of things I would say if it was an album, but I've already said a lot of shitty things about it, so fuck it. But anyways, thank God that did not see the light of day as an official release. But in 2002, they began the writing process and gradual recordings, and then in the mid-2000s, like 2004, 2005, the band would actually go to Peter Tägtgren from Hypocrisy over at the Abyss studio, the legendary Abyss, to record this next album, and released in 2006, we get Monotheist. This is my number 3 album, and dare I say, in terms of what is the heaviest Celtic Frost album, this is it. Like, holy shit, guitar tone has been achieved. Like, that tone is so thick and chunky and brutal sounding. But yet, when it comes down to it, this marked another major change for Celtic Frost. There's not really any thrash or black metal to speak of. This is more of like a gothic death doom album. Like, it's so doomy, yet it has some of that gothic overtone, that gothic atmosphere on top, mixed in with the more death doom sound that's coming in here. Songs like Progeny, Ground, A Dying God Coming into Human Flesh is a particularly dark journey of a song. Drown in Ashes, which is a very dark, depressing song, featuring vocals from Lisa Middelhoff, I believe, formerly of the symphonic metal band Xanderia. And there were guest vocalists all over this album, including the 14-plus minute opus that is Synagoga Satanae, featuring Ravine from 1349, Seder from Satyricon, and Peter Tägtgren himself doing guest vocals on this song. And that was the second part of a 3-part track called Triptych, where you got part 1, Totengat, which is this more like scary, haunting, like atmospheric track with Martin Eric Ain just screaming his ass off. Then it gets into Synagoga Satanae, ending with Chapter 3, Winter Finale Requiem, which was actually meant to be the third part of the series of songs that started with Rex Irae Requiem off of Into the Pandemonium. There was no second part released. This was the third part, and it's this beautiful symphonic piece that just adds to the depression that some of this album was able to provide. Like, this album almost felt like a mix of what Asphyx would become, mixed with a little bit of like early Paradise Lost, My Dying Bride, eventually what Hooded Menace would do. Like, you could kind of hear where some modern Death Doom kind of got a little bit of their influence from this album. But man, was this dark, depressing, heavy, brutal, and yet disturbing at the same time. And what a way to go out. Now, of course, the band toured big time for the following couple of years in support of this album. However, due to ego issues involving Franco, the drummer, thinking that he's going to take over the band, at least according to Tom and Martin, in the end, Tom and Martin decided to break up Celtic Frost because of that. And pretty much leave the band to rest. Now, not too long after Celtic Frost broke up, Tom Warrior would start a new band called Triptychon, which basically continues and builds on the sound of Monotheist, that gothic death doom style. And it made 2 phenomenal albums since the band was formed. And then, unfortunately, Martin Arcane passed away in 2017 after a heart attack, which was a huge loss to the metal community. But overall, the legacy of Celtic Frost... wow, my voice about went away. Overall, the history of Celtic Frost remains that they were a very important band in the development of extreme metal, especially death metal and black metal, because you would hear particularly black metal bands like Darkthrone take what Celtic Frost did, but do it in their own way, and even death metal bands like Obituary, who have said they were highly inspired by Celtic Frost and Hellhammer, and basically both bands would take what Celtic Frost did, but do it in their own unique ways, which is why Celtic Frost have always been so important to both genres. Have never really been on one end of the scale over the other. They were always like right in the middle of both styles, like the atmosphere from black metal mixed in with the heaviness and somewhat brutal nature of death metal. But yeah, Celtic Frost will always remain one of my all-time favorite bands, and I was happy to be on here to rank all 7 of their major releases. Now, like I said, if I was to have mixed Morbid Tales and Emperor's Return together, it would have been my number 1, but had to make some rules for this. But that is my opinion on the Celtic Frost album ranking. How would you guys rank these albums? What's your favorite Celtic Frost album? Do you agree with me that Vanity Nemesis is the most underrated Celtic Frost album, like I said in the video? But let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as far as I'm going to go ahead and announce who the next discography ranking is going to be for, because I put up the poll on YouTube not too long before this, and pretty much running away with the votes is Morbid Angel. So the next ranking will be for Morbid Angel. However, that won't be out until later this month, like towards the end of the month. So definitely look out for that towards the end of May. But until next time, horns high. See you soon.
You know, it was pretty organic. I have a rocker dad. So growing up, there were not only like driving in his car and around the house, there was great music playing, but you know, if I was ever able to sneak into the man cave of the basement that he had, that was, you know, off limits after a certain hour, you know, there was a cool collection of vinyl. That's where titles like Fistful of Metal, Violence and Force, Number of the Beast, Kiss's Destroyer, which was massive for me. You can imagine being a 6-year-old kid and pulling out the LP cover for Destroyer.
Oh yeah,
how life-changing that could be.